The first sign wasn't the screaming. Civilizations had screamed before when they faced extinction. The Valkyrie had screamed when their sun collapsed. The Nexus Collective had screamed when the plague ships arrived. Even the mighty Cathrin Empire had screamed when their homeworld cracked like an egg. No, the first sign was the silence that followed. Ambassador HFY of the Galactic Council pressed her forehands against the observation deck's reinforced glass, watching the last transmission from the outer rim fade into static. Her species had evolved from predators, but even her enhanced senses couldn't detect what had consumed 17 star systems in the span of 3 rotations. "Report," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had negotiated peace between species that communicated through pheromone clouds and others that spoke in electromagnetic pulses. The tactical officer, a crystalline being whose body reflected the bridge lights in prismatic patterns, turned with movements that created musical tones. "Ambassador, we've lost contact with all settlements beyond the Helix Nebula. No distress calls, no emergency beacons, no survivors. Just..." The officer's form dimmed. Nothing. HFY had seen empires fall. She had watched species evolve beyond physical form, and others devolve into primitive savagery. But this was different. This wasn't conquest or natural disaster. This was erasure. "What about our deep space monitors?" she asked. "They show massive energy signatures moving through the affected regions. But the readings don't match any known technology. The patterns suggest something vast, something that treats star systems like we treat individual asteroids." A new voice cut through the bridge's tension. "May I suggest a theory, Ambassador?" HFY turned to face Dr. Keth Morn, the Council's chief xenobiologist. His species looked like walking trees, with bark-like skin and leaves that changed color with his emotional state. Right now, those leaves had turned the deep purple of profound worry. "Speak freely, Doctor. I've been analyzing the pattern of disappearances. They're not random. Whatever this entity is, it's moving with purpose, following established trade routes and communication networks. It's learning our infrastructure as it consumes it." The bridge fell silent, except for the hum of life support systems. HFY's mind raced through the implications. "You're suggesting it's intelligent, more than intelligent. Strategic. It's not just destroying civilizations, it's absorbing their knowledge, their capabilities. Each system it consumes makes it more dangerous to the next." "Estimated time until it reaches the core worlds?" HFY asked, though she dreaded the answer. The tactical officer's crystalline form pulsed with rapid calculations. "At current pace, 18 rotations. Maybe 20. If we're fortunate." HFY's hands clenched into fists. 18 rotations to evacuate 50 billion souls across a dozen species. It was impossible. But then, the impossible had been the Council's specialty for 3,000 years. "Initiate Code Omega," she commanded. "Contact every member species. Full military mobilization. And..." She paused, accessing records that hadn't been opened in centuries. "Send a message to the Sol system, Doctor." Kethmorn's leaves shifted to bright yellow, the color of surprise. "Ambassador. The Terrans entered voluntary isolation 400 years ago. They explicitly requested no contact unless the galaxy faced extinction." HFY pulled up the ancient treaty, its holographic text still burning with the same intensity as the day it was signed. "I believe this qualifies." The message to humanity was simple, as their ancestors had requested. No elaborate protocols, no diplomatic flourishes. Just the facts. An unknown entity was consuming the galaxy, system by system. Estimated arrival at Earth's region in 30 rotations. The Council formally requested assistance under Article 7 of the Terran Isolation Accord. The response came faster than expected. Not from Earth, but from deep space monitoring stations that most species had forgotten existed. Automated systems that had been quietly watching the galaxy for 4 centuries. Recording everything. Learning everything. "Acknowledged," came the reply in perfect galactic standard. "Humanity is aware of the entity you describe. We have been tracking its progress since it emerged from the void reaches. Stand by for instructions." Instructions. Not requests, not suggestions. Instructions. HFY felt a chill run through her forearms. She had read the historical records about humanity's early years in the galaxy. Before their isolation, they had been active participants in the Council, contributing their particular talents for adaptation and innovation. But those records also contained warnings from species that had underestimated human capabilities. The Gordak hegemony had made that mistake once. They had attacked a human colony, expecting easy conquest of a young species with primitive technology. 3 rotations later, the hegemony's entire fleet had been scattered across 6 star systems. Their crews alive, but their ships repurposed into hospital vessels and refugee transports. The humans had taken a military force and transformed it into a humanitarian mission without firing a single shot. That had been 400 years ago. What had humanity become during their centuries of silence? The answer began arriving in the form of sensor readings that made no sense. Ships were approaching from the direction of Earth, but they weren't following any known principles of physics. They moved through space as if momentum and inertia were merely suggestions. They appeared on sensors as solid matter one moment and pure energy the next. "Ambassador," the tactical officer whispered, "I'm detecting approximately 10,000 vessels approaching our position, but their energy signatures are impossible." Impossible how? They're reading as both matter and antimatter simultaneously. They exist in normal space, but also show quantum entanglement signatures with parallel dimensions. And their size. The officer's form flickered with disbelief. Some of them register as larger than our moon. But their mass readings suggest they're hollow, or possibly existing in folded space. HFY accessed her species' memory archives, searching for any reference to such technology. She found fragments, myths really, about ancient civilizations that had transcended physical limitations. But those were stories told to younglings, not operational reality. A new transmission arrived, this time with visual accompaniment. The figure that appeared on the main screen looked human, but something about the image felt wrong. The proportions were too perfect, the movements too fluid. When it spoke, its words carried harmonics that suggested multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. "Greetings, Galactic Council. I am Commander Vance of the Terran Deep Fleet. We understand you're facing an extinction-level threat." HFY stepped forward. "Commander, yes. We've lost contact with 17 systems in the past 3 rotations. Our analysis suggests an entity of unknown origin is consuming entire civilizations. We're familiar with the entity. We've been monitoring it since it first manifested in our dimensional space. We call it the Hunger." "Your dimensional space?" Dr. Kethmorn interjected. "Commander, what exactly has humanity been doing during your isolation?" The figure that called itself Commander Vance smiled. And for a moment, HFY glimpsed something behind the human features. Something vast and patient, and utterly alien to any species she knew. "Learning," Vance replied. "Growing. Becoming something capable of protecting what we love." The tactical officer's form brightened with incoming data. "Ambassador, I'm reading massive energy buildups throughout human space. It's like their entire civilization is waking up." Vance nodded. "The Council is hereby advised to implement full evacuation protocols for all systems in the Hunger's path. Move your populations to the core worlds and establish defensive perimeters around critical infrastructure." "Commander, with respect, our combined fleets can't stop something that's consumed 17 systems without trace." "What makes you think, Ambassador?" Vance interrupted, and his voice carried new harmonics that made everyone on the bridge step back involuntarily. "You're thinking in terms of conventional warfare. The Hunger isn't a military threat. It's a predator that feeds on the life force of entire civilizations. But predators, no matter how large, can still be prey to something higher on the food chain." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that humanity has spent 4 centuries learning how to be at the top of that chain." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. HFY stared at the blank screen, processing what she had just witnessed. The human had spoken with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem they couldn't solve. But this wasn't some technological challenge or diplomatic dispute. This was a force that had erased entire star systems. "Ambassador," the tactical officer said softly, "I'm reading something you need to see." The main display shifted to a long-range sensor view of human space. What HFY saw defied every principle of stellar engineering she knew. Stars were moving. Not drifting in their ancient orbits, but repositioning themselves with mathematical precision. Entire solar systems were arranging themselves into geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. "That's impossible," Dr. Kethmorn whispered. "Stars don't move like that. The energy required to alter stellar motion would exceed the output of most galactic civilizations. Unless," HFY said slowly, "you're not moving the stars themselves. You're moving the space they exist in." The implications hit her like a physical blow. During their isolation, humanity hadn't just advanced technologically, they had learned to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality itself. They were treating space-time like other species treated raw materials. A priority alert chimed through the bridge systems. The hunger had accelerated. It was consuming systems faster now, as if it had sensed something new in the galaxy. Something that might pose a threat. "Time to core world arrival?" HFY asked. 12 rotations, came the grim reply. But even as the tactical officer spoke, new readings flooded their sensors. The geometric patterns forming in human space were generating effects that rippled across the galaxy. Gravitational waves that carried impossible harmonics, quantum fluctuations that seemed to be rewriting the laws of physics in localized areas. And somewhere in that space, something was stirring. Something that had been sleeping for centuries, dreaming patient dreams while the galaxy went about its business. Something that was finally opening its eyes and taking notice of the predator that dared hunt in its territory. The hunger had consumed 17 civilizations. It had grown fat and confident on the life force of entire species. It moved through space like a god. Unstoppable and inevitable. It was about to learn that there were things in the universe older than gods, and some of them were very protective of their neighborhood. Humanity was waking up, and the universe held its breath to see what would happen when they were fully alert. The last time humanity had been truly threatened, they had rewritten the rules of war itself. This time, they might rewrite the rules of existence. The hunger had made its first mistake. It had assumed it was the apex predator in this galaxy. It was about to discover just how wrong that assumption was. Commander Vance disconnected from the Galactic Council transmission and allowed his human appearance to dissolve. The bridge around him shifted as well, revealing its true nature, not metal and circuits, but something that pulsed with living energy, responding to thought as much as command. He was no longer entirely human, hadn't been for over a century. But then, neither was anyone else aboard the Deep Fleet. They had volunteered for transcendence when humanity first detected the entities lurking in the spaces between galaxies. The things that fed on civilizations like the hunger. "Analysis complete," announced Dr. Sarah Chen, though her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Her consciousness distributed through the ship's neural network. "The hunger is following predictable patterns. It's a fairly young entity, maybe 50,000 years old. Crude but effective." Vance accessed the collective memory banks, reviewing 4 centuries of human observation and preparation. When humanity had entered isolation, it wasn't from fear or xenophobia. It was because they had detected something moving in the deep dark between galaxies. Something that treated entire civilizations as food. The galaxy's younger species weren't ready for that knowledge. So humanity had withdrawn, ostensibly to pursue their own development. In reality, they had been preparing for war against entities that existed on scales most species couldn't even imagine. "Wake the Guardians," Vance commanded. Across human space, monuments that other species had assumed were artistic installations began to stir. They had watched them being built, massive structures positioned around every human world, geometric forms that seemed to serve no practical purpose. The galaxy's xenoarchaeologists had theories about their function, most involving human religious practices or cultural expression. None of them had guessed that each structure contained a sleeping human consciousness, expanded beyond biological limits, and given the power to manipulate matter and energy on planetary scales. Captain Elena Vasquez opened her eyes for the first time in 40 years. Around her, the Guardian Station responded to her awakening, its crystalline structures resonating with frequencies that made local space itself more stable. She had volunteered for this duty when the monitoring stations first detected the Hunger's approach to the galactic edge. 40 years of sleep, dreaming deep mathematical dreams, learning to think in ways that biological brains couldn't process. When she had entered the station, she had been human. Now she was something that could hold the gravitational patterns of an entire star system in her mind and adjust them like a musician tuning an instrument. "Status report," she requested. And the answer came not as words, but as direct knowledge transfer. The Hunger had accelerated its consumption rate. 19 systems now. It was learning, adapting, growing stronger with each civilization it absorbed, but it was also revealing its nature. Elena could see the patterns now, the way it moved through higher dimensions to bypass normal space. It existed partially outside the universe, which was why conventional weapons couldn't touch it, but existing between dimensions meant it was subject to different laws of physics. Laws that humanity had spent 4 centuries learning to manipulate. Elena reached out with senses that no biological species possessed, feeling the texture of space-time around the Hunger's location. It was crude in its approach, simply tearing holes between dimensions and pouring itself through. Effective against civilizations that thought in 3 dimensions and linear time. Less effective against opponents who could think in 11 dimensions and treat causality as a suggestion. All Guardians online, came the collective acknowledgement from 2,000 awakening consciousnesses, each one anchored to a Guardian station, each station positioned to allow precise manipulation of local spacetime. Admiral Rebecca Torres had been the first to volunteer for Transcendence when the project began. She remembered being human, remembered the weight of biological existence and the limitations of organic thought. Now she existed as pure consciousness networked through the Deep Fleet's most advanced vessels. "Begin Phase 1, she commanded. Across human space, the geometric patterns formed by relocated stars began to generate effects that rippled through multiple dimensions. To outside observers, it looked like an elaborate light show. In reality, humanity was tuning the fundamental frequencies of local reality, preparing to isolate their section of the galaxy from whatever the Hunger might attempt. The process would have been impossible for biological minds to coordinate. There were too many variables, too many simultaneous calculations required. But the Guardians were no longer limited by neural processing speeds or the chemical delays of organic thought. They thought at the speed of light through quantum-entangled networks. They could hold mathematical concepts that would have driven their biological ancestors insane, and they had learned to reshape reality through applications of physics that most species hadn't even theorized yet. "Contact from the Council," reported Lieutenant James Park, his consciousness distributed through the communication array. "They're requesting details about our defensive capabilities." Torres considered the request. "How do you explain to species that still think in terms of ships and weapons that you've learned to treat the universe itself as both shield and sword? How do you tell them that humanity had discovered ways to exist that transcended the normal limitations of matter and energy? Tell them we're implementing a containment strategy," she decided. No details beyond that. The truth was classified not from paranoia, but from necessity. The techniques humanity had developed could be devastating if misused. They had learned to manipulate time, to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, to alter the basic constants that governed physics in localized areas. In the wrong hands, such knowledge could unmake entire star systems. So, humanity kept their secrets and used their abilities only when the galaxy faced threats beyond conventional understanding. Like now, Professor Michael Chang accessed the historical databases, reviewing everything known about entities like the Hunger. His consciousness had been distributed through humanity's research networks for over 2 centuries, slowly accumulating knowledge that no individual mind could have processed. He had memories of civilizations that existed before the current galactic community, species that had faced similar threats and failed. The Hunger wasn't unique, it was part of a class of entities that existed in the spaces between galaxies, feeding on the life force of developing civilizations. Most galaxies eventually faced such predators. The successful ones learned to defend themselves. The unsuccessful ones became feeding grounds for entities that grew fat on the accumulated life force of entire species. Humanity had known this was coming for centuries. They had prepared not just defenses, but strategies for permanently ending such threats. Analysis complete, Chang reported to the collective consciousness. The hunger shows standard predator characteristics. It's been growing complacent, feeding on civilizations that couldn't effectively resist. Its defenses are oriented toward conventional threats. Weaknesses? Admiral Torres inquired. Its interdimensional existence means it's vulnerable to dimensional anchoring techniques. If we can force it fully into normal space, it becomes subject to conventional physics. But doing so requires precise manipulation of 11-dimensional space. We have the capability. Chang's response carried undertones of grim satisfaction. Yes. But implementation will require coordination across 400 Guardian stations and the entire Deep Fleet. The calculations alone would exceed the processing capacity of most galactic civilizations. Good thing we're not most civilizations anymore. The Deep Fleet began moving into position, their ships traveling through folded space to reach coordinates calculated to 11 decimal places. Each vessel was positioned to create specific gravitational and quantum effects when the operation began. Commander Vance accessed the navigation protocols, marveling at how far humanity had come. When they entered isolation, they had been an ambitious species with clever technology. Now they were something that could redesign local reality to serve their purposes. The transformation hadn't been easy. Thousands of volunteers had been lost in the early experiments. Their consciousness scattered across dimensions they couldn't navigate. But humanity had learned from each failure, gradually developing techniques that allowed organic minds to transcend their biological limitations. They had become something new, something that could think in ways that biology had never intended. And they had done it all in preparation for threats that most of the galaxy didn't even know existed. Phase 2 initialization, Torres commanded. Around the galaxy's perimeter, the Guardian stations began generating harmonic frequencies that propagated through 11-dimensional space. To most sensors, it registered as background radiation. In reality, it was humanity beginning to rewrite the local laws of physics. The hunger would enter a trap 4 centuries in the making, a section of space where the normal rules no longer applied, where an entity that existed partially outside reality would find itself subject to forces it had never encountered. But first, they needed to get its attention. Dr. Chen accessed the communication networks, preparing to send a message that would reach the hunger across multiple dimensional frequencies. The message was simple, designed to be understood by any intelligence capable of interstellar predation. Unknown entity. The transmission began, propagating across dimensions in ways that made nearby stars flicker. You are trespassing in protected space. Withdraw immediately or face consequences. The response came faster than expected. Not words, but raw meaning impressed directly onto the quantum substrate of local space. The hunger was amused. It had consumed 19 civilizations without meaningful resistance. It considered humanity's warning the equivalent of insects threatening to sting. Then let us show you what kind of insects we've become, Admiral Torres murmured, initiating Phase 3. Across human space, the Guardian stations reached full harmonization. 2,000 human consciousnesses working in perfect coordination. Their combined mental capacity focused on a single task, forcing an interdimensional predator into normal space, where it could be properly dealt with. The mathematics involved were staggering. They were essentially creating a dimensional anchor large enough to affect an entity that spanned light years. The energy requirements would have exceeded the output of most star systems. Fortunately, humanity had learned to draw power from more than simple fusion reactions. They tapped into the zero-point energy of space itself, the quantum fluctuations that existed even in perfect vacuum. They borrowed energy from parallel dimensions and paid the debt by making small improvements to the fundamental constants of physics. The hunger felt the trap closing and began to accelerate toward human space. No longer leisurely consuming systems but moving with predatory urgency. It had encountered resistance before, but never anything that could actually threaten its existence. As it approached, reality began to change around it. The normal laws of physics were being replaced with something more restrictive, more limiting. The entity found its interdimensional existence becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. For the first time in 50,000 years, the hunger experienced something it had almost forgotten: fear. Humanity was forcing it to become fully real, fully present in normal space. And once it was trapped there, it would discover what 4 centuries of preparation had produced. The universe held its breath, waiting to see what happened when an interdimensional predator met a species that had learned to think outside the normal limitations of existence itself. The hunger entered the trap with the confidence of a predator that had never encountered effective resistance. It had consumed 19 civilizations, growing fat on their accumulated life force. In its 50,000 years of existence, nothing had threatened it enough to cause genuine concern. As it crossed into human space, reality began to change around it. The familiar ease of slipping between dimensions became increasingly difficult. The entity found itself being forced into normal space, compressed into 3 dimensions like a vast intelligence being squeezed into a container too small for its essence. Admiral Torres monitored the dimensional anchoring process through her distributed consciousness, watching as thousands of years of predatory existence were constrained into physical law. The hunger was magnificent in its terror, a creature of living darkness that spanned multiple star systems, its consciousness older than most stellar formations. But age meant nothing when you were dealing with a species that had learned to think beyond the normal limitations of existence. Full manifestation achieved, reported Guardian Captain Elena Vasquez. Around her station, space itself had become malleable, responding to thoughts that operated on frequencies beyond biological comprehension. The entity is now fully subject to conventional physics. In 5. The hunger raged against its confinement, lashing out with energies that should have sterilized entire systems. But humanity had prepared for this. The Guardian stations absorbed the entity's attacks, channeling the energy into the quantum substrate and using it to reinforce their dimensional locks. Phase 4, Torres commanded. What happened next would have driven most sapient species insane to witness directly. Humanity revealed the true extent of their transformation over 4 centuries of isolation. Commander Vance shed his remaining human appearance entirely, becoming something that existed as pure thought interfacing with the fundamental forces of the universe. Around him, the Deep Fleet's vessels revealed their true nature, not ships, but manifestations of human consciousness given form and purpose. They had learned to exist without biological constraints. Their minds expanded beyond organic limitations. But they had retained something that most transcendent species lost: their essential humanity, their capacity for protective fury when something they loved was threatened. The galaxy had been their neighbor for centuries. The countless species trying to evacuate their worlds, the civilizations facing extinction, they were all part of a community that humanity had chosen to protect. The hunger discovered this when humanity began to demonstrate what they had really learned during their isolation. Dr. Chang accessed the collective memory banks, retrieving techniques developed over centuries of preparation. Humanity had studied the hunger's kind, learning not just how to defend against them, but how to neutralize them permanently. Initiating Protocol Omega, he announced across the network. The Guardian stations began generating harmonics that operated on frequencies beyond normal spacetime. They were singing in mathematical languages that rewrote local reality, creating effects that no conventional technology could produce. The hunger felt itself beginning to change. Its vast consciousness, distributed across multiple dimensions, was being systematically compressed and restructured. Humanity wasn't just trapping it, they were transforming it into something that could no longer harm other civilizations. But the entity had one final strategy. If it was going to die, it would take as much of the galaxy with it as possible. The hunger began to destabilize its own structure, preparing to explode across dozens of star systems in a final act of spite. This was what humanity had really been preparing for. Not just stopping the entity, but preventing the kind of cataclysmic death that could sterilize entire galactic regions. Admiral Torres felt the collective consciousness of humanity focusing to a single point of absolute determination. 2,000 guardians, millions of transcended minds, and 4 centuries of preparation, all directed toward a single purpose. They were going to save everyone, Not just their own species, not just their allies, but everyone. Every civilization in the galaxy, every species that had ever looked up at the stars with hope and wonder, because that was what humanity did. When faced with extinction, they didn't just survive. They ensured that everyone else could survive too. Implementing Final Protocol, Torres announced. What humanity did next violated so many fundamental laws of physics that reality itself seemed to pause in confusion. They reached into the quantum substrate of the universe and began rewriting the basic constants that governed existence in their local area. The speed of light became negotiable. Entropy became reversible. Causality became optional. And in that bubble of reorganized reality, humanity performed surgery on an interdimensional entity older than their entire species. They carefully dissected the hunger's consciousness, separating its predatory instincts from its basic intelligence. They preserved its memories and experiences, while eliminating its need to consume other civilizations. They transformed a cosmic predator into something harmless but still viable. The process required computational resources that exceeded the processing capacity of most galactic civilizations. It demanded understanding of physics that some species wouldn't develop for millions of years. But humanity had become something capable of holding entire universes' worth of information in their collective consciousness. They performed the impossible with the casual precision of surgeons operating on a familiar patient. When it was finished, what had been the hunger was something else entirely. Still vast, still ancient, but no longer driven by the need to consume other civilizations. Humanity had given it a new purpose, tending the spaces between galaxies, watching for other predatory entities, and warning civilizations of their approach. They had turned their enemy into their earliest warning system. The Guardian stations powered down their reality manipulation fields, allowing normal physics to reassert itself. The Deep Fleet's vessels resumed their conventional appearances, though everyone who had witnessed their true forms would carry those memories forever. Commander Vance re-established contact with the Galactic Council, once again wearing a human appearance that didn't quite hide what he had become. Ambassador Zephi stared at him through the transmission, her forehands trembling. "Commander, our sensors detected massive energy fluctuations throughout your space, but we couldn't determine their source. What happened to the entity?" "We dealt with it," Vance replied simply. "But how?" "Our best analysis suggested it was indestructible by conventional means." Vance smiled, and for a moment his expression carried hints of vast amusement. "Ambassador, humanity stopped using conventional means centuries ago. We've learned that when the universe presents you with an impossible problem, you change the rules until it becomes possible." "You changed the rules?" "We changed everything necessary to protect the civilizations we care about. The entity you called the Hunger no longer poses a threat to anyone. In fact, it's now working to prevent other such entities from entering our galaxy." Dr. Kethmorn's leaves had turned colors that indicated confusion bordering on philosophical crisis. "Commander, what exactly has humanity become during your isolation?" Vance considered the question carefully. "How do you explain transcendence to species still thinking in biological terms? How do you describe becoming something that existed beyond the normal limitations of matter and energy, while still retaining the core values that made you who you were?" "We became what we needed to become, to protect everyone else," he said finally. "We learned to think beyond conventional limitations, because the threats we face require unconventional solutions." The transmission ended, leaving the Council to contemplate what they had witnessed. Across the galaxy, civilizations that had been preparing for extinction began to realize they were safe. The hunger was gone, not destroyed but transformed into something that would actually protect them from similar threats. But the galaxy's scientific communities would spend the next several centuries trying to understand how humanity had accomplished the impossible. How do you rewrite the laws of physics? How do you perform surgery on an entity that exists in 11 dimensions? How do you transform a cosmic predator into a cosmic guardian? The answers to those questions were classified, locked away in human memory banks, and protected by safeguards that operated beyond normal space-time. Humanity shared their knowledge carefully, gradually, only with species that demonstrated they could use such power responsibly, because the truth was terrifying in its implications. Humanity had become something that could reshape reality at will. They could rewrite the fundamental constants of physics, manipulate causality itself, and perform transformations that bordered on godlike in their scope. They had transcended the normal limitations of biological existence while retaining their essential humanity. They were no longer just a species, they had become something that existed as living concepts, interfacing with the deepest levels of reality. And they had chosen to use that power not for conquest or domination, but for protection. They had become the galaxy's immune system, the force that dealt with threats too large and complex for conventional responses. The universe shivered because it had produced something unprecedented. A species that had achieved transcendence without losing their compassion. They had become gods, who still remembered what it felt like to be mortal. And that memory drove them to protect other mortals from forces beyond their understanding. Other entities in the deep dark between galaxies felt the hunger's transformation and reconsidered their own predatory plans. Humanity had demonstrated something that sent ripples of concern through dimensions most species didn't even know existed. They had shown that they could not only defend against cosmic predators, but transform them into allies. They had taken something that fed on civilizations and turned it into something that protected them. The message was clear to any entity intelligent enough to understand it. This galaxy was under protection by something that thought in ways that even cosmic predators found disturbing. Something that treated the impossible as merely inconvenient. Something that had learned to rewrite reality itself in service of protecting others. The universe shivered, not in fear of humanity's power, but in awe of what they had chosen to do with it. They had become something beyond godlike, and they used that transcendence to ensure that smaller, younger species could grow and develop without facing extinction from forces beyond their comprehension. Humanity had awakened, and the universe was a safer place because of it. But somewhere in the deep dark, other ancient entities began to take notice of this galaxy where impossible things happened with disturbing regularity, where the normal order of predator and prey had been completely reorganized by something that refused to accept that extinction was inevitable. They would be coming eventually, and when they did, they would discover that humanity had spent centuries preparing for them too. The universe held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when truly ancient powers met a species that had learned to treat the impossible as merely another engineering challenge. It was going to be interesting.